The rain fell in sheets across the battlefield, turning the red earth into a muddy grave for the fallen. Captain Elena Rodriguez gripped the controls of her fighter jet as enemy fire erupted around her aircraft. Below, she could see a military convoy under heavy attack, their vehicles scattered and burning along the mountain road. "Mayday, mayday! Ground unit requesting immediate air support." The desperate voice crackled through her radio. Elena could see soldiers taking cover behind destroyed vehicles, completely surrounded by enemy forces. Without hesitation, she dove her aircraft toward the chaos below. Her training kicked in as she identified the enemy positions and began her attack run. Explosions lit up the mountainside as her missiles found their targets, but the enemy had anti-aircraft weapons waiting. A missile struck her left wing, sending her jet into a violent spin. Elena fought with the controls as alarms blared in the cockpit. The ground rushed up toward her as she struggled to maintain altitude. She could see one soldier in particular, a tall man with general's insignia, trapped behind an overturned jeep with enemy fighters closing in. Elena made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of ejecting to save herself, she used her dying aircraft as a weapon. She aimed the nose of her jet directly at the enemy positions surrounding the general, knowing it meant certain death. The explosion when her plane hit the ground was massive, taking out the entire enemy squad and creating enough confusion for the general and his men to escape to safety. The general looked back at the burning wreckage, trying to see if the pilot had survived. Through the smoke and flames, he caught a glimpse of a parachute in the distance. Someone had ejected at the last possible second. He wanted to search for the pilot who had saved his life, but his men were already pulling him toward the evacuation helicopters. As they lifted off, he promised himself he would find that brave pilot someday and thank them properly. Elena had indeed ejected, but barely. She landed hard in the dense forest, her parachute tangled in the trees. Her left leg was badly injured, and she could hear enemy patrols searching for her. For 3 days she crawled through the wilderness, surviving on rainwater and wild berries, always staying one step ahead of her pursuers. When she finally reached friendly territory, Elena was barely conscious. The medics rushed her to a field hospital where doctors worked for hours to save her leg. But the injury was severe, and complications set in. The infection spread faster than the antibiotics could fight it, and despite the best efforts of the medical team, they had no choice but to amputate her left leg below the knee. Elena's military career was over. The woman who had once soared through the skies, who had saved countless lives including that of a general, now faced a future she had never imagined. The physical therapy was brutal, learning to walk again with a prosthetic limb while dealing with the trauma of losing everything she had worked for. The military offered her a desk job, but Elena couldn't bear the thought of being trapped behind paperwork while others flew the missions she once loved. She declined their offer and left the service, taking her small disability pension and trying to figure out what to do with the rest of her life. The woman who had once been decorated for bravery now felt like a broken shell of her former self. 2 years later, Elena found herself standing on a busy street corner in the capital city, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Homeless veteran, please help." The woman who had once commanded a $1 million fighter jet now depended on the kindness of strangers for her next meal. The transition from military hero to homeless veteran had happened faster than she could have imagined. Her disability pension barely covered rent for a tiny apartment, and when she lost her part-time job at an auto repair shop due to her mobility issues, everything fell apart. The landlord had no patience for late rent, and within a month, Elena was living in her car. When the car broke down and she couldn't afford repairs, Elena joined the growing number of veterans living on the streets. She found shelter in doorways, under bridges, and sometimes in the emergency shelters when they had space. The other homeless people she met had their own stories of hardship, and Elena learned to navigate this invisible world that most people pretended didn't exist. She tried to maintain her dignity despite her circumstances. Elena kept herself as clean as possible, washed her clothes whenever she could find access to facilities, and always said please and thank you to anyone who showed her kindness. But she noticed how people looked at her, or more often how They looked right through her as if she didn't exist. The prosthetic leg made everything harder. Walking long distances was painful, and she couldn't run if dangerous situations arose. Some nights, Elena would sit in dark alleys and wonder how her life had come to this point. She remembered the feeling of flying, the rush of adrenaline during combat missions, the respect of her fellow soldiers. Now she was just another face in the crowd of society's forgotten people. Despite everything, Elena refused to beg aggressively or make people uncomfortable. She would simply stand quietly with her sign, grateful for whatever help people could offer. Some days she made enough money for a decent meal, other days she went hungry. The irregular eating and constant stress began to take a toll on her health. One particularly cold morning, Elena was standing near the entrance to a government building where she knew there would be foot traffic. A group of well-dressed officials walked past her, deep in conversation about military contracts and defense spending. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here were people making decisions about military funding while actual veterans stood invisible, just feet away from them. A businessman, in an expensive suit, dropped a few coins in her cup, without even looking at her face. "Thank you, sir," Elena said quietly, but he was already walking away, talking loudly into his phone about some important meeting. She had become just another part of the urban landscape, as unnoticed as a fire hydrant or street lamp. Elena began to understand why so many veterans struggled with the transition to civilian life. In the military, she had purpose, structure, and respect. On the streets, she had none of those things. She was completely alone in a city full of millions of people, invisible despite standing in plain sight every single day. Meanwhile, General Marcus Thompson had been promoted and was now serving as the Secretary of Defense. The successful military operation where his life had been saved had earned him recognition throughout the highest levels of government. He often thought about that mysterious pilot who had sacrificed their own safety to save him and his men that day in the mountains. The general had spent considerable time and resources trying to identify the pilot who had saved his life. Military records showed that Captain Elena Rodriguez had been the pilot of the aircraft that crashed during the rescue operation, but she had disappeared from official records after leaving the military on medical discharge. Every inquiry he made led to dead ends, forwarding addresses that were no longer valid, phone numbers that had been disconnected. He had even hired a private investigator to help track down Elena, but the trail went cold after she lost her apartment and became homeless. The investigator found records of her brief employment at the auto repair shop, but after that, it was as if she had vanished completely. General Thompson began to worry that she might have died from her injuries or taken her own life, unable to cope with her disabilities. The guilt weighed heavily on the general's conscience. Here he was, living in a mansion in the prestigious part of town, attending state dinners and commanding respect wherever he went, while the person who had saved his life was nowhere to be found. He had tried to locate her family, but Elena had been an only child, and her parents had died in a car accident years before her military service. Every morning, the general's driver would take him to work through the downtown area where many homeless people gathered. He began to pay closer attention to the faces he saw on the street corners, wondering if one of them might be his missing hero. He started carrying cash specifically to give to homeless veterans, hoping that somehow word would get back to Elena, that he was looking for her. The general established a foundation to help homeless veterans, partly out of genuine concern, but mostly because he hoped it might somehow reach Elena. He appeared at countless charity events, always asking organizers if they had heard of Captain Elena Rodriguez. No one ever recognized the name, and his searches continued to come up empty. His wife noticed how the search for this mysterious pilot had become an obsession for her husband. "Marcus, you can't save everyone," she would tell him. "You've done everything you can to find this person. Maybe it's time to accept that some people don't want to be found." But the general couldn't let it go. The debt he owed this pilot felt too significant to simply forget about. One evening, while reviewing reports about veteran homelessness in the city, the general was struck by a disturbing statistic. Thousands of former military personnel were living on the streets, many of them disabled combat veterans who had fallen through the cracks of an inadequate support system. He realized that Elena might be one of these invisible people, surviving, day-to-day just blocks from where he worked. The general decided to take a more direct approach. He began personally visiting homeless shelters and soup kitchens throughout the city, showing Elena's old military photograph to staff and volunteers. Most people couldn't remember seeing her, but a few thought the face looked familiar. The general felt he was getting closer to finding the pilot who had saved his life, though he had no idea she was standing on street corners just minutes away from his office building every single day. The day that would change everything started like any other for Elena. She woke up in the doorway of an abandoned building, her body stiff from sleeping on concrete. The prosthetic leg always hurt more in cold weather, and she had to massage her stump for several minutes before she could stand and walk. Her daily routine had become mechanical: find a public restroom to wash her face, get to her usual corner before other homeless people claimed the spot, and hope for enough donations to buy food. On this particular morning, Elena noticed increased activity around the government buildings. Black cars with official license plates were arriving, and security personnel were setting up barriers. She didn't pay much attention to political events anymore, but the increased foot traffic might mean more potential donations from people walking by. Elena positioned herself near the entrance to the federal building where she had stood many times before. She held her simple cardboard sign and kept her head down, not making eye contact with passers-by unless they stopped to help. Most people hurried past without acknowledging her presence, and Elena had grown accustomed to being invisible. Around midday, a convoy of official vehicles pulled up to the building. Elena glanced up briefly and saw several men in expensive suits and military dress uniforms stepping out of the cars. One man in particular, a tall figure with general's insignia, caught her attention for just a moment. Something about his bearing seemed familiar, but Elena quickly looked away. She had learned not to stare at important people, as security guards would sometimes move her along if they thought she was making officials uncomfortable. The general was walking toward the building entrance when his aide mentioned something about the homeless veteran situation in the city. "Sir, the mayor's office has received several complaints about the increase in panhandlers near government buildings. They're requesting that we coordinate with local police to move them to designated areas." General Thompson paused and looked around. His eyes swept over the various homeless individuals positioned near the building, including Elena. For just a moment his gaze lingered on her, but she was looking down at the ground. Something stirred in his memory, but he couldn't place what it was. The woman looked tired and weathered, her clothes clean but obviously old and worn, like so many other veterans he had seen during his visits to shelters. "No," the general said firmly to his aide. "These people have as much right to be here as anyone else. Many of them probably served our country with honor. We don't move them anywhere unless they're causing actual problems." His aide nodded and made a note on his clipboard. As the general walked past Elena, she looked up briefly to nod a quiet thank you for his kindness in defending the homeless people's right to be there. For just a split second, their eyes met. The general felt a jolt of recognition, something about those eyes that seemed familiar, but the moment passed so quickly he dismissed it as his imagination. Elena watched the important man disappear into the building and felt a strange sense of connection, though she couldn't explain why. There had been something about his face that reminded her of someone from her past, but her memory was fuzzy from years of stress and poor nutrition. She shook off the feeling and returned her attention to the people walking by, hoping someone might spare some change for lunch. Inside the building, General Thompson found himself distracted during his meeting. Something about the homeless woman outside kept nagging at him. Her posture, the way she had looked up at him, something was familiar but just out of reach in his memory. He made a mental note to take a closer look at her when he left the building, but the meeting ran long, and by the time he emerged, Elena had moved on to find dinner at a nearby soup kitchen. 3 days later, Elena was back at her usual spot when an unexpected incident changed the course of both their lives. A group of teenagers, clearly from wealthy families based on their designer clothes and expensive phones, had been walking past when one of them decided to film Elena for social media entertainment. "Look at this dirty lady," the teenager said loudly, pointing his phone camera at Elena. "She's probably just pretending to be homeless to get free money. I bet she drives a nice car home every night." His friends laughed and encouraged him to get closer for a better video. Elena tried to ignore them and move away, but the prosthetic leg made quick movement difficult. The teenagers followed her, making cruel comments and jokes about her appearance and disability. One of them noticed her limping and started mocking the way she walked, exaggerating her movements while his friends recorded everything. "Please just leave me alone," Elena said quietly, but this only encouraged them more. They began to circle around her, blocking her path and demanding that she prove she was really homeless. The situation was escalating, and Elena could see other people on the street starting to stare, but no one stepped forward to help. Just then, General Thompson emerged from the building after another meeting. He immediately saw the commotion and recognized the homeless woman from 3 days earlier, being harassed by the group of young men. Without hesitation, he strode toward the situation with the authority that came from decades of military command. "That's enough," the general said in a voice that had commanded thousands of soldiers. The teenagers immediately stopped their harassment and turned to see who was addressing them. When they saw a high-ranking military officer approaching, their bravado quickly disappeared. "Sir, we were just having some fun," one of them said nervously. "We weren't hurting anyone." "You were harassing a military veteran," General Thompson said sternly. "This woman served her country, probably with more honor and courage than you've ever shown in your entire privileged lives. You should be ashamed of yourselves." The teenagers mumbled apologies and quickly dispersed, suddenly very interested in being somewhere else. The general turned his attention to Elena, who was still trying to process what had just happened. She looked up at him with gratitude and surprise. "Thank you, sir," Elena said, her voice shaky from the stress of the confrontation. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," the general replied. "Are you all right? They didn't hurt you, did they?" As he spoke, he studied her face more carefully. Those eyes, the shape of her features, something was definitely familiar, but he still couldn't place it. "I'm fine," Elena answered. "I've dealt with worse than some kids with phones, but I do appreciate your help." She paused, then added, "You said I was a military veteran. How did you know?" "Your posture, the way you carry yourself despite your circumstances. Plus, I've been working with veteran services lately, and I've learned to recognize the signs." The general was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What branch did you serve in?" "Air Force," Elena replied. "I was a pilot before." She gestured toward her prosthetic leg. Before this happened, the general felt his heart start beating faster. "A pilot? What kind of aircraft did you fly?" Elena hesitated. She rarely talked about her military service because it brought back too many painful memories. But this man had just defended her honor against those teenagers, and she felt she owed him an honest answer. "Fighter jets mainly, F-16s and F-18s. I did combat missions in several theaters before my aircraft was shot down, and I was injured." Elena's voice grew quiet as she remembered that final mission, the explosion, the aftermath that had led to her current situation. General Thompson felt the world shift around him as pieces of a 3-year puzzle suddenly began falling into place. "Captain Elena Rodriguez," the general said slowly, and Elena's eyes widened in shock. No one had called her by her rank and name in over 2 years. "How do you know my name?" Elena asked, stepping back slightly in confusion and fear. In her experience, when people from her past found her in her current condition, it rarely ended well. General Thompson's voice was filled with emotion as he replied, "Because you saved my life 3 years ago in the mountains. You crashed your fighter jet to take out the enemy positions that had me and my men pinned down. I've been searching for you ever since." Elena stared at him in disbelief. The face she had glimpsed through the smoke and chaos of that battlefield, the man she had seen being evacuated as her world went dark, was standing right in front of her. The person whose life she had saved had become one of the most powerful military officials in the country, while she had fallen into homelessness and obscurity. "You're the general from the convoy," Elena said quietly, memories flooding back. "I remember seeing you behind that overturned jeep. You were surrounded and your men were taking heavy casualties. And you used your aircraft as a weapon to save us, the general said. I watched your jet dive straight into the enemy positions. It was the most courageous thing I've ever witnessed. When I saw that parachute in the distance, I wanted to search for you, but we had to evacuate immediately. Elena felt overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the conversation. I can't believe you remember me. I can't believe you've been looking for me. I've been looking everywhere, General Thompson said. I hired investigators, visited shelters, established foundations to help homeless veterans, all hoping to find you. I never imagined you were right here, just blocks from where I work every day. His voice was filled with guilt and regret. How long have you been living on the streets? About 18 months, Elena replied. After I lost my leg and couldn't fly anymore, everything just fell apart. The disability payments weren't enough. I lost my job, then my apartment, then... She gestured to her current situation. The general felt a mixture of anger and determination wash over him. This is unacceptable. A war hero, someone who saved my life and countless others, should never have been allowed to fall through the cracks like this. I'm not a hero, Elena said. I'm just a broken-down veteran who couldn't make it in the civilian world. You are absolutely a hero, the general said firmly. And starting right now, that's going to change. He pulled out his phone and began making calls. I'm arranging for immediate temporary housing, medical care, and we're going to get you back on your feet properly. Elena felt tears streaming down her face, the first time she had cried in months. Why would you do all this for me? Because you gave me a second chance at life when you saved me in those mountains, the general replied. Now I'm going to give you a second chance at the life you deserve. Within hours, Elena found herself in a clean hotel room with a hot shower, fresh clothes, and a meal that didn't come from a soup kitchen. General Thompson arranged for her to receive proper medical care for her prosthetic, job training programs, and eventually a position working with other homeless veterans. 6 months later, Elena stood before a room full of military officials and government leaders sharing her story as part of a new initiative to prevent veteran homelessness. She wore a sharp business suit and walked confidently with her improved prosthetic leg. General Thompson introduced her as both a war hero and a survivor who had overcome tremendous challenges. The woman who had once been dismissed as just another street person was now helping to reshape how the country cared for its veterans. And the general, who had never forgotten the pilot who saved his life, had finally repaid a debt that had weighed on his conscience for years. Sometimes, Elena realized, the most important battles are won not in the sky, but in the simple act of recognizing the dignity and worth of every person, especially those whom society has chosen to overlook.